All portraits of Anne Boleyn that survive were done posthumously. Without any reliable contemporary images of Anne, we turn to the next best thing, gossip and ambassadorial reporting, from those who would certainly have seen Anne in the flesh. Anne was only reasonably good-looking, according to a favoured cleric, scholar. Francesco Sanuto, the ambassador to Venice, wasn't even that gracious. "Not one of the handsomest women in the world," he sneered back to his master. "She is of middling stature, swarthy complexion, long neck, wide mouth, bosom not much raised, and in fact has nothing but the English king's great appetite, and her eyes, which are black and beautiful." It is those dark eyes of Anne that crop up again and again in contemporary reporting, as well as later portraiture. The French ambassador, Lancelot de Carl, was particularly complimentary, stating that Anne had the most attractive eyes, which she knew well how to use with effect, sometimes leaving them at rest, and at others sending a message to carry the secret witness of the heart. And truth to tell, such was their power that many surrendered to their obedience. Talk about a come-hither glance. Hand in hand with the dark eyes comes the raven black hair. Cardinal Wolsey, again, not Anne's biggest fan, rather bitchily referred to her as the Night Crow, but this was probably much more a comment on how he perceived Anne's personality than anything about her physical appearance. However, Anne was almost certainly not a blonde. Thomas Wyatt's poetical name for his adored Anne was brunette, likely the first known use of the word in English. But in this context, it rather meant dark-haired girl from France, as opposed to girl with brown hair, as it does today. There are many who argue that the term brunette meant for a long time hair of any hue, as long as it was dark. In fact, some believe that Anne may have had auburn hair, a chestnut colour with reddish tones. Watching Anne dance once, the French King Francis declared, "Venus était blonde, on m'a dit. L'on voit bien qu'elle est brunette." They say Venus was a blonde, but you can well see that she is a brunette. It is this darkness of Anne that is so interesting. She completely broke the mould in terms of both Tudor beauty and Henry's other wives and mistresses. Her own sister, Mary Boleyn, erstwhile lover of the king, is usually taken to have been a blonde. Catherine of Aragon, her predecessor on the throne, is shown in portraits done of her as a young girl to have had strawberry blonde hair. Jane Seymour, too, is usually taken for a blonde due to the paleness of her eyebrows in paintings. Anne of Cleves we are unsure about, but she was probably mousy brown in colouring. Catherine Howard was another redhead, and it is likely that Catherine Parr was also a blonde. Blonde was beautiful in medieval Europe, and fair-headed wives were very, very desirable. Medieval marital advice was typical of the following quotation: "Look for a woman with a good figure and with a small head, hair that is blonde but not from henna, whose eyebrows are spaced apart, long and arched in a peak, who is nice and plump in the buttocks." Blondes were considered to be much more submissive and biddable, and the lightness of their hair and complexion was seen as an outward manifestation of the goodness of their soul within. Even today, we still suffer from the black-white dichotomy. Fairy tale princesses are always yellow-haired, their evil stepmothers menacing in their darkness. When the Victorians took up Anne's cause and reinvented her as a tragic heroine, they most often chose to cast her as blonde in their paintings and writings, to better highlight their take on her as an innocent. So far, we have built up a picture of an Anne with dark hair, although probably chestnut brown as opposed to raven black. She was very proud of her hair, and wore it loose and flowing whenever ceremony allowed her to after her marriage. It was long enough for her to sit on. Along with this glorious dark mane, she had expressive and alluring dark eyes set in an oval face with rather strong features. She was unfortunately rather olive-toned in complexion and had a rather boyish figure. Going by the ideals and preconceptions of her own time, she had almost nothing going for her. But Anne was exotic, It is often said that her adolescence in the French court had given her little affectations and a grand sense of style and how to convey herself. Many people commented on her elegance and grace, and how she was more French than a Frenchwoman born. From a Frenchman, so a compliment. She wasn't afraid to use those much remarked upon eyes to flirt. She was very accomplished, speaking several languages and playing numerous instruments. She had a finely honed sense of her own parr, taking great pride and care in her appearance. Even before she became queen, she was a trend-setter at court, with all the other ladies rushing to have their seamstresses create them something similar to what the Mistress Anne had late been sporting. It really isn't hard to see how a young woman like this would have caught the attentions of illustrious men like Thomas Wyatt, Henry Percy, and of course, King Henry. After her execution by the swordsman from Calais, Anne's body lay on the scaffold for some time. Perhaps nobody had truly believed that Henry would have his wife killed. Anne herself confessed to her ladies and Archbishop Cranmer that she thought Henry would end up sending her to live out her years in a nunnery. No coffin had been ordered, no burial preparations made. After a while, Anne's decapitated body was placed into an elm chest, which had been used to deliver arrows to the Tower. The chest was too small, so her head, wrapped in white linen, was likely placed ingloriously between her legs. A hasty, shallow grave was dug in front of the altar in St. Peter ad Vincula, the Tower's chapel, next to that of her brother, who had been executed 2 days previously. Her fine gown would have been removed, perhaps given to the executioner as spoils, so the Queen of England was laid to rest in her undergarments. And so Anne lay undisturbed for many years. In the 1870s, it became unavoidable that St. Peter ad Vincula would have to face restoration. The floor was sinking, and proper foundations needed to be introduced. Using records and historical sources, the Victorians created a plan of where they imagined the Tudor nobles, aka Henry's victims, would have been buried. Due to the passage of time and the probability that there would have been other burials disturbing the originals, they didn't expect to actually find anything definitive. But when they lifted the stones and dug in the spot where the plan indicted Anne Boleyn would be, they immediately struck bones belonging to a female of between 25 and 30 years of age, of a delicate frame of body, and who had been of slender and perfect proportions. The forehead and lower jaw were small and especially well formed. The vertebrae were particularly small, especially one joint, the atlas, which was that next to the skull, and they bore witness to the Queen's little neck. Anne was either in her early 30s or late 20s when she was executed, depending on whether you adhere to the 1501 or 1507 birth date, so this fits nicely. As is to perhaps be expected in the chapel of the Tower of London, the neck bones also proved that this lady had been decapitated.